am Heidi Huseman, and I am an undergraduate psychology major at the University of Central Oklahoma. My research focus as a student has been on decision making in groups. So today I'm going to be talking about a few underlying psychological processes that can affect the decisions we make and the policies we develop here at ICANN. So I'm going to be talking about biases today. Just to highlight a few things about the multi-stakeholder model that we all know and love so very much, ICANN is designed to be a community-driven, multi-stakeholder organization where all voices can participate and many perspectives are considered, but that doesn't eliminate all types of bias in itself. I think that the multi-stakeholder model can control for many explicit biases, but implicit biases still do exist in community groups, and I do think that it is important to recognize that. What is bias and why is it important? I think most of us have a general understanding about what explicit bias is, but like I mentioned, implicit bias exists as well. Explicit bias is intentional and deliberate bias. In this community based organization where we have many voices, we do kind of dilute any potential for explicit biases. But implicit biases are those that are not always intentional, they're not always deliberate, but we all do have biases, whether we want to or not, just as a result of living and exposure and experiences that we have. Bias is a tendency to hold a certain outlook or judgment, and as I mentioned, that is can be as a result of the organizations we affiliate with or how we have learned certain topics and their relevance to our job or our life as a whole. As an organization that develops policies, and policy development really is just a series of decisions made in different capacities. It's important for us to understand that biases do happen and why they're relevant because we do have one world, one internet, but there are 8 billion people in between. And we do need to make sure we understand why we're making these policies and how they can be representative and helpful to the whole population. I am going to be talking about three different types of biases today. The first one I'm going to be talking about is the availability bias. Availability bias, as many of the other biases do, it does have a name that is relevant to what it describes. The availability bias is a bias that you have based off of the most and easiest available information to you. When we are here at ICANN, it's important to understand that the presence of the information we see affects the decisions that we make and what we view as a priority versus a non priority. With many people here representing their employers, it is important to realize that they have a certain kind of knowledge that differs from most people, and we do just want to make sure that everything is relevant to all. For an example, I'm going to hypothetically bring a situation with my mentor, Paulo. He did say that I could do that a few weeks ago, so I hope you do remember that. Paulo, you have experience in marketing and domain registration, is that correct? Okay, so in a community group or a working group, Paulo would be more likely to advocate for more marketing initiatives and more domain registration awareness because that is what he works with most often and that is what's most available to him. The next bias I'm going to be talking about is the confirmation bias. The confirmation bias and the availability bias do go hand in hand. The confirmation bias, I think we're pretty familiar with. It's when you seek out information that supports your point of view or what is important to you while not really looking at or ignoring contradictory information. But confirmation bias can hinder effective policymaking because it interferes with the types of information we can bring upon to look at in a group about what's really important and why we think that's important. So, if Paulo were wanting to look for more marketing initiatives and advocate for more domain name awareness, he would be looking for statistics that show a support and a need for more marketing and more domain name registration and involvement. The last bias I'm going to talk about today, and one that I think is most important to look at when looking at a community like ICANN, is the self selection bias. Self selection bias is the selecting of oneself to a particular preferred environment. Here at ICANN, we have many different communities for each level of expertise. So this is one that is kind of in the design of ICANN, but still relevant nonetheless. It's important to consider when we look at the policies we developed here at ICANN, because many participants here do have prior experience through maybe their job or they're just repeat ICANN participants. It's important to understand that the self selection bias may not always be fully representative of the whole population, as the participants at ICANN are self selecting what they want to volunteer for and how they want their voices to be heard within the community. How can bias still occur if ICANN is community based? Even though ICANN is community based, many of the people here are repeat ICANN participants. As Wyatt mentioned, ICANN is largely an organization of seasoned pros. There have been more initiatives to get newcomers to ICANN, which is why I'm here as part of the NextGen program. But still, it is crucial to understand who's making the decisions and why they might be making those decisions through their line of work or just their prior expertise and knowledge. Again, ICANN is largely made of volunteers, and not everyone knows about ICANN or has the opportunity to fully connect to ICANN. So that is just relevant to understanding how we make decisions in a community forum like ICANN and how the policies that we develop can be skewed by types of bias. The next slide is just my references, but if any of you have any questions, I would welcome them at this time.
Great job, Heidi. Questions for Heidi? Glenn, I'll start with you.
Thanks for the presentation. Are you aware that the NomCom have implemented along the lines what you have here? They select the board members and others, people in the community, and they've actually implemented a professional on helping the NomCom committee do trained in unconscious bias. Fredo can talk about it in more detail, but it was a real eye opener. We all have biases, right? And so it's important in selecting the board members and others that you grapple with that issue. So I think that's another example. I'm not an employee of ICANN. I want to declare that. No bias on my part, but that's an example of where ICANN is actually a very tangible idea.
Thank you for that comment, Glenn. I appreciate you mentioning that.
Thanks, Glenn. David, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm David Margland. I'm counsel to the Ombuds. So a little dialogue, and then maybe I'll get to my question. I think I heard you say that there are good biases and bad biases, and that we all have biases. Is that sort of more or less your position?
Yes.
Right. And so, for example, one good bias, I think we would agree, is look at all these volunteers who want one internet, one world, and come and for room and board spend umpteen hours of work. That's a good bias. You're not trying to get rid of that bias, right?
Correct, yes.
But there are other biases, confirmation bias, self-selection bias, whatever that you want to root out and ferret out. You would call those bad biases because they're not always apparent. How do you see yourself, one, and not yourself necessarily, but how do you see categorizing the good biases from the bad biases? And then two, how do you go about bringing them to the surface, I guess, step one, and two, limiting the harm that the bad biases do to the organization or the individuals they're in? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your question. So I do just want to reiterate, I'm not necessarily saying that the biases that I mentioned are necessarily malicious. In some instances, they can be beneficial, but that doesn't make it any less relevant to understand that they exist. More so, the objective is to monitor who's a part of the decision groups and who they may represent through their involvement with ICANN. Did you have another question in there? I'm sorry, I might have missed something.
Yeah, my question was, once you've determined that biases are bad, for example, you might be aware that there's a draft code of conduct that requires you to state who you represent and what interests you might have. So conflict of interest kind of thing. That is one way of fleshing out and perhaps limiting biases. Any other ways that you can think of that you would like to see ICANN implement to help curb the bad biases or at least root them out?
I definitely understand. That may be a little bit more of a conversation for a later time, as there's no one right or direct answer to that, and I don't even have one direct answer to that. Um, but I do think that awareness and education about bias in general for everyone helps us understand where some people may be coming from. But I would like to talk to you more about that later if you have time.
Thank you. Any other questions? Roberto, please go ahead.
Well, first a comment. When you were going through the bias, I was automatically thinking about some parts of the icon where those apply will really 100%. Two things. First of all, I'm looking forward to have volume 2 of this. You identify the bias. I think that the what is going to be very important is how can we mitigate these biases. So I'm sure that in the interest of time, you had no time, but that is the specific. One question: some of the biases are voluntary, and some are non-voluntary. In the sense, some of the bias happens just by fact that we have incomplete information. For instance, to refer to the first one, do you make a distinction on when the bias is inherent in the fact that there are conflicts of interest, and when the bias is just happening because it's a fact of life, and but is not the parties that are trying to get consensus are not intentionally creating a bias.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Roberto. I do think that most often in a community, from my awareness of ICANN, it is the latter situation that you mentioned, as it just kind of happens. And I'm sorry, what else did you say? I totally forgot.
No, the question is that when you describe those biases, I think that for instance, the incomplete information can be just it happens without anybody willingly hiding some information. It's just because we don't have it. There are other biases that come from the fact that there are different interests, and so people are pushing in one direction or the other. And in a general study, would you make a distinction between those two cases where the bias happen not by the willingness of one party or the other, and just happens by chance or by fact?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you were to do a study on that, that is definitely something that you want to distinguish between the two. Uh, how you would really go about conducting that fully, I'm not entirely sure, but yes, I think there is a distinction to be made there.
Thank you. Any other questions? Alfredo, go ahead, please. Oh, there was an online question as well. Let me go to that one first, and then we can get to you.
There was a question, but actually the question was what policy recommendations to identify and counteract these biases in in various ICANN processes, but somehow in your responses to other questions, you covered some of this. But if you would like to take some of this, what policy recommendations are there to identify and counteract these biases in various ICANN processes, that would be great.
I do think the first and foremost step is to just educate people about what bias is and how it affects the policy development process, because that's it's not something that we always consider, that bias isn't always intentional. And we do think that we control for that through the bottom up multi stakeholder process of policy development. But I do think that having a general understanding of what bias is can definitely help eliminate any potential threats.
Excellent. And there was a follow-up actually comment that though the researcher might find it helpful going forward, she could highlight the distinction between conflict of interest and bias, and overt bias and implicit bias, which her focus seems to be on the later, but the audience seems confused.
Yeah, for sure. If I were to carry on this project, that's definitely something I would want to look more into and make a little bit more clear, but with only a small allotted time. There's not a whole lot of depth to reach through that.
Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, Alfredo, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Great presentation, but I agree with the comment made online. You have to sort of clarify some aspects of that. And yes, I don't know if you're aware that in ICANN Learn, there's a course dealing precisely with biases and type of biases. So if you haven't looked into that, I suggest you look into that. The other thing is that, as Glenn mentioned, within the nomination committee, which is an external organization within ICANN, completely independent in terms of how we do business. As a matter of fact, it's so independent that nobody knows what we do when we're in our sessions and the process we follow. We do consider clearly the concept of biases because that's part of something that we want to eliminate. As the counselor from the Ombuds mentioned, that's something that's being right now revised in all the documentation that refer to conflict of interest, code of conduct, etc. So if you're not aware of that, I would invite you to look into that because ICANN is taking the steps to avoid all the types of biases that you can think of, even the good ones. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, certainly. I definitely will look into that. Thank you for mentioning that.